Good evening all and welcome. I have a chilling collection of cryptid stories, so be sure to let me know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe, press the bell icon, and let the darkness take control. During 1999, I worked briefly as a vacuum cleaner salesman. And yes, the job was as terrible as it sounds, which required very late nights, as I was often at customers' homes until around 9 p.m. before having to go back to the head office to check out, then drive back home, often not arriving until midnight or later. I was working late on this particular night, and I was on the home stretch around 10 minutes from home, when my old, crappy, cheap Ford Fiesta began to overheat. I knew the car wouldn't make it home, and had no choice other than to pull into the lay-by on top of the big, dark and deserted mountain next to my town. My hometown is literally the last town before there are just mountains and forests for countless miles. As I pulled into the mountain parking area with steam pouring my engine, a white humanoid figure, obviously surprised that a car was pulling into a deserted parking space in the middle of the night, ran directly in front of my headlights as it sprinted from the edge of the clear side of the parking area and into the forest on the other. It had no clothes, features, genitals or hair, just a white figure with 2 arms and legs that appeared almost luminescent and reflective in my lights. To say I defecated myself is an understatement. My eyes popped out my sockets when it ran in front of me, but then I realized that I was stuck in a dead car in a deserted mountain lay-by in the middle of the night with no mobile phone signal, as this was back in the day when mobile phones were just starting to become popular, but large chunks of the country were missing from network coverage. I had no choice but to sit there for around an hour until my car cooled down, as it gave up the ghost pretty much the second I pulled in. So I sat in my car alone, staring directly into the forest where the thing I saw had run. No weapon, no way to contact anyone to let them know where I was, and no passing traffic to possibly flag down. During my wait in the car, I obviously started to wonder what I'd seen. I knew for a fact that I had actually seen something, and it was not a trick of the light, that much was clear. I discounted sheep, horses, foxes, or any other animal that populated the Welsh mountains, as I was certain it was a 2-legged humanoid creature shape and roughly humanoid with a head, body, arms and legs. The obvious answer would have been that it was some kind of strange man who for some reason was wearing a white entire body stocking. But since we were miles away from the nearest home, and I was the only car around, I think it was highly unlikely that someone would have spent hours walking through thick forest just to hang out at a parking area in the middle of a forest wearing a unitard. Since I could rule out possible animals or humans, I had to consider the alternative, which isn't a nice thing to think about when you're stuck in a broken car, with this very creature possibly still outside. I didn't think it was aliens, because it was too tall compared to the classic look. While any type of apparition or ghost didn't tend to run away from people when surprised. I'm not sure if there's some kind of Welsh version of the Wendigo, but if I had to categorize this encounter, that would be my number one choice. There was always talk of satanic rituals and witches practicing in the forest when I was a kid, and also a lot of illegal bare-knuckle fights where people had been killed and buried there to cover up the crime. But I didn't think much of that at the time, as I always wrote it off as superstition and rumor. But now I'm not so sure. Eventually my car cooled down enough for me to limp back home. No one really believed me when I told them what I saw, and are adamant that it was just a sheep. But to this day I will swear that the creature I encountered was something different. I've been in the forest many times since, camping, biking and hiking, and have never seen anything like that again. But whenever I go there, I'm always aware of the possible presence of the Goat Man. Back in the late 90s, myself and 2 of my friends were staying at their vacation home on one of the local rivers. The house, think 3 small bedrooms and sitting room/kitchen and a small external bathroom, is on a privately owned island which isn't theirs, which is used for cattle grazing, and is about 3 to 4 square miles in area. It is accessible only by one dirt road, which takes all of half an hour to travel down, as it bends and winds through dense swamps full of alligators and marsh plains. Along the road, there is one other house, just as you get onto the island, which has long been abandoned. The old 2-story plantation-style home was supposedly abandoned when the owner's child suffered a fatal accident, and the couple couldn't stand being there anymore. Aside from my friend's house, the cattle farmer's home, and one other vacation home and the abandoned property are the only structures. My friend and I were out on the dock doing some night fishing, trying to land a shark or something to throw on the grill, but we hadn't had much luck. The river was smooth as glass, which was really unusual because of where the dock is. The current there is usually very strong, even during the tide shift. We sat and chatted waiting for a bite, up until about 11 p.m. Then, off of our right towards the coast, we heard a loud tone or wail which sounded like a mix between a ship's horn or maybe a wolf howl or something similar. An important note is the island is, by car, nearly an hour from deep water access, and probably more from an actual ocean, so the likelihood of that sound being a large ship was low. We were startled by the sound, and even my friend, who had been spending his summers there since he was in diapers, had never heard this noise before and was bothered by it. So we decided to pack it in since we weren't catching anything anyway, and had nearly gotten all our equipment back to the house when my second friend heard it. Coming from down the road, back towards the island access, was what sounded like either a cat meowing or a child crying. We all stood in silence listening and trying to figure out what it was and where it was coming from. After listening for about 5 minutes, we decided to hop in the truck and drive down the road a ways with the window down, so we can try and find what was making the sound. What started out sounding like a cat was made clear as we got further up the road that it was not the case, and we could clearly hear a child, and it sounded like it was saying, "Help me." We drove very slowly, calling out, and we'd wait a few minutes and hear, "Help me," again, but always further up the road towards the swamps and the old abandoned house. We were seriously freaked out, because if there was a kid out there, why would they be going away from our calls and right into the swamp? We nearly made it all the way to the abandoned house where the sound just stopped, and we waited for nearly an hour but never heard it again. We marked it up as nerves and headed back to the river house, assuming it had been an animal after all, and that we probably were just imagining it saying words. Well, after we had gotten back inside and settled in for the night, we started hearing it again, but as time passed it came closer to us. We went out and called out again, and the sound would come closer. This went on for hours. Well, we decided we would try one more time to see if there was a kid lost or something. But once we got out in the truck again, the noise stopped. Remember, we are miles away from the nearest people, and the noise sounded like a 4-year-old. It was now 3 a.m., and we had been out in the sun, fishing and swimming all day, and were tired. And after driving around a bit, calling out again with no luck, we gave up. We get back inside again and get into bed. Then we hear it clear as a bell. "Help me," right outside the house. But it sounded so strange, like an echo, like it was close but far. And like hell if any of us were brave enough to go commando and leave the house. But we went out onto the porch, which was screened in for bugs, and listened. As soon as we went out it would stop. We'd go back to bed, and it would call again, but in a different location outside the house. It circled, calling, all night. In the morning we went out and looked for tracks around the houses, and the foundation is basically sand. There were no marks, no prints, animal or otherwise, and to the best of my knowledge it never happened again to any friend or other visitor. To this day we don't know what we heard. It's probably the most supernatural thing I've ever experienced. I'll start by saying that I'm an experienced outdoorsman. I'm a hunter, hiker, and camper. I don't usually spook too easy because I basically grew up with a gun in one hand and a fishing pole in the other, and maybe a magnesium fire starter hidden somewhere special, as well as a knife, which I always carry. I have 3 stories for you about being hunted, 2 of which I consider explainable. I hunt in Montana, in a town not far north of Mille Lacs Lake. One season I was fairly deep in the woods on a snowmobile trail. When I hunt, I typically carry my .30-06 and my knife and pack. I feel fairly confident in the woods, but this season I had some concern. The deer population seemed lower on our property recently, and we knew there were wolves around because you can hear them howl at night, and we found tracks. But they typically don't mess with people, fortunately. But as I was scanning for deer tracks in the dirt, I found a different set of tracks that stood out to me. It looked canine minus the nail marks, and were a bit wider. The paw on it appeared to be that of an 150-pound animal. Then it clicked on me that this was a feline track, a big one, fairly fresh. I knew there were no bobcats around, but they didn't get that big. The next logical step was to assume it was a cougar. Now I decided to double back, so I'm heading back east on the trail, and my dad calls me to ask to do a push through the woods towards his stand, and I say sure. At this point his stand is maybe 500 meters through thick woods from me, and I'm concerned about predators. But I'm 6'4" and 190 pounds before putting my gear on, and that statistically speaking, cougars don't tend to attack healthy adult men. So I push forwards. I get about halfway to the other stand and get concerned because I lost my marker, so I stop to regain my bearings. Then it hit me. My gut tells me, you're being watched. It's then that I notice how still the woods are. They're very quiet, and that's when I heard a branch snap behind me about 20 meters away. I ready my rifle and scan in a circle and only see trees and brush. I wait, and it's just so quiet. So I push forwards towards my dad's stand, thinking the whole time I'll hear something not far behind me quietly keeping pace. Eventually I stopped hearing it, and the woods went back to normal with birds singing and whatnot. Then I stepped out on a trail about 40 meters from my dad's stand. I suspect it was the cougar that made the tracks. My guess is they thought I would put too much of a fight for prey, or it winded my dad and chose to back off, but I never did see. But something strange was definitely following me. The second story happened maybe 2 years ago. I decided to take my fiancée hiking after work one evening in a park with some nice bluffs to climb for a great view. Now, this isn't a particularly safe thing to do, especially at this time of night, so I gave her my tactical knife and carried my .40 caliber pistol. We arrive and park the car. We started heading up a trail about 100 meters in. We spook and jump what I think was a deer. It hauled ass away from us so quickly that I only saw a flash of tan and maybe its flag. And honestly, it scared us pretty good too. So now I'm on edge, and we round a crest in a hill, where I see a black mass to my left in the peripheral vision. I unsnap the retention on my holster and turn to engage. A mound of black dirt. Now I calm down, and we continue on. It's a nice evening, birds chirping still, bugs making noise, regular forest stuff. Within 200 meters of the halfway point on the trail, we start to feel like we're being watched. This eerie feeling. This time it clicked right away. The woods are now dead, but I start noticing movement keeping pace with us. So I keep moving us towards the top of the hill, the high ground, which is the halfway point on the trail. We reach it and stop, and it stops, but the woods are still dead calm. and my fiancée tells me she thinks we're being followed. So we decide to move on and take a shortcut back down the bluff to the paved trail. We make it and the woods go back to normal sounds again. We consider hiking more, but we were a bit too spooked and left the park. Now whatever was following us, I suspect was another cougar. But it was quiet, almost too quiet, and we didn't see it. And the strangest part is that the stalking noises it did sounded elevated, like it was moving from tree to tree. And big cats have been known to do this, but not very often. My final story is the least explainable of all. This happened around June or July of 2007. I was 17 and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwest Wisconsin, and I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin or at least by the bonfire by the beach because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was, if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach. And at night, you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy. That is until this incident. So this happened between 12 and 2 p.m. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo and he was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters in to about a third of the way up the trail. We had had enough at this point and was standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail, talking, and he was about 10 feet from me. When I decided to mess with him, I shushed him and said we were being watched. He froze, and then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds. But it wasn't normal, as this wolf was on 2 legs crouching next to a tree with its arm grasping the tree, grasping with a clawed hand. It appeared to have reddish-brown fur. I informed my cousin that we needed to leave, and the next thing I know he is sprinting, and I looked back at Wolfie, who had locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet, and then turned and ran. When it looked like Wolfie, it was dropping to all fours. It charged at us and sounded like it was right on our asses, barreling through the brush, but for whatever reason let us go when we broke out of the tree line and went towards the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. This creature appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright, and that, where its front paws should have been, it appeared to have large clawed hands. And I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I've heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do they get that big, and black bears more waddle on 2 legs. The closest description is silly, but I think it would be a dogman, or even a skinwalker, if you believe in that sort of thing. But what do you think? I was visiting Honduras and was discussing the paranormal with my cousin. They said they'd never seen a ghost, but that everyone there has a duende story. The most interesting was a schoolmate of my cousin's. So my cousin's schoolmate was a beautiful blonde girl. Beautiful inside and out, not conceited, super sweet and friends with everyone, especially the town losers, my cousin being one of them. She apparently had a duende, some sort of tiny little elfy creature that was following her since she was 8. He was obsessed with her and would throw rocks at any boy that tried to date her. As she grew older, it got annoying, and her suitors would be scared away by this rock-throwing elf. My cousin told her to tell the elf to go away, and she said any man scared of an elf is not worthy of my affections. Ha! Fast forward to her being a 30-year-old virgin. She's got a boyfriend who was not afraid of the elf and continued to date her even though this elf messed with him a lot, throwing rocks, stealing his keys, leaving nails around his car. So things in their relationship reached the next level, and the elf was so repulsed by this he finally left her alone. Another story comes from my grandmother. When she turned 40, doctors told her that by 50 she'd be completely blind. She was very religious and not superstitious at all, but she was desperate to save her sight. A neighbor told her about a herbalist living in the mountains of Copan, who had a whistling duende as her assistant. My grandmother went with her friend to visit the woman. She told the woman what the doctor said about her eyes, and the woman translated to the duende by whistling. My grandmother and her friend said they didn't see the duende, but they did hear someone whistling back in response. The duende apparently whistled to the woman to give my grandmother some herbs he'd gathered. My grandmother took the strange herbs, and although her eyesight did not get better, it did not get any worse, and she passed away at 70 with the same prescription she had at 40. A friend of mine said she had a witch for her grandmother, and while staying at Grandma's witch hut, she would tell my friend and her sister to stay away from a tree because a duende lived there. The stories go that the duendes will steal little blonde girls. My friend said she didn't believe in witches or elves and thought her grandmother made up the story to keep the girls close to the house. One afternoon, they were playing hide and seek near the tree to be naughty. After counting to 10, she saw someone run behind the tree and followed it thinking it was her sister. She found her sister staring wide-eyed at something, and it was the duende. She was 10 at the time, and it was shorter than her, had a pointy hat and a super wrinkled face, almost like an opossum, smiling from ear to ear. It reached to grab her little sister, but she grabbed her sister first, and they took off running to the house. When they got to the house, they told their grandmother about the duende, and she simply said, "I told you to stay away from that tree." About a year ago, I was out back with my family. It was around 8 and the sun was setting. We lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, and the closest neighbor was far away. Something down the field kept catching my eye, but I ignored it at first. My sister saw it too, and kept looking out towards the trees. She was getting freaked out by it. My mum said to go investigate, so me and my sister began walking across the field towards the tree line. Big mistake. It's hard for me to describe, but it was the most terrifying thing which has ever happened to me. I didn't see it at first, and I didn't understand why my sister was so scared until we were around 100 yards away. When I saw this creature, tall, probably 8 or 9 feet, white, humanoid with an elongated head and no face. It had long arms and picked around the trees. We stopped in our tracks. We couldn't tell what it was. It took a few steps further out of the trees and swayed back and forth like a praying mantis. Me and my sister ran screaming back to the house, where my mum stood, jaw dropped. She saw it too. I've never been so afraid in my life. We grabbed the binoculars and watched this terrifying creature peeking in and out of the tree line, spying on us. My grandma thought we all had a wild imagination. The sun was almost gone now, and it was getting really dark, and the darker it got, the more it moved back and forth along the trees. It was terrifying, so we went in for the night and locked everything up tight. I couldn't sleep that night. I was hearing scratching on the roof. Now at one point a very loud bang, and various noises were coming from the barn. I was afraid that I would wake up to my animals missing, and the next morning my grandma asked if we heard a loud bang outside the barn that night. She ended up taking my grandpa on her morning walk. I have no idea what it is, but to this day, it still haunts me. I used to live in Georgia when I was starting 6th grade. The bus stop I waited at usually had 4 to 5 kids, but one morning it was just me and Bubba. His nickname was Bubba. It was really kind of foggy, and just a really grey late fall morning. I said good morning when I got there as we stood side by side. We were both just staring into the wall where the woods started across the road, and we were both quiet. After some minutes, I see this enormous bird fly out of nowhere. It was so large and black. I thought it was a vulture, but it was so big from how far we were. It was beyond the tree line into the woods, flying along it. It flew about 50 to 60 feet, more like hovered and only flapped its wings twice. But it was like watching a cartoon. It just vanished behind a tree. I was standing there for a minute after, like, what the hell did I just witness? Did I just imagine that? Bubba breaks the silence and says, "Did you see that, or am I crazy?" I exploded. We were trying to discuss what it was. I was young, but I wasn't stupid. I was aware of how big birds can be even at that age. I'd seen a big bird before with a huge wingspan. This was just freakish and cartoonish and didn't move right. I tried to brush it off like maybe it was a giant big black vulture, but everything about it was just off, and I think about it a lot. I was new to Georgia, but Bubba grew up there, and when I looked into his eyes, I knew whatever this thing was different. Over my 26 years, I've experienced numerous paranormal encounters, which I've always believed in, especially since I live above an old hospital. I have autism, which means I'm usually very critical and seek answers to everything, but there are some things which cannot be explained. One of my earliest and most vivid encounters has stayed with me for what feels like an eternity. I've shared this story briefly with family and friends, and while believers in the paranormal listen with interest, skeptics often dismiss it as just a dream. Despite sometimes questioning it myself, it felt far too real to be a mere nightmare. This is the first time I'm sharing this. This story dates back to when I was around 7. In the summer of 2002, my family and I went on holiday to Morfanefin, a small seaside town in North Wales. I was 7, my brother 5, and my baby sister was about to turn 1. We were joined by my grandparents and Aunt Laura. To make this trip easier, my grandparents rented a large car so that we could all travel from Norfolk to South London and then North Wales, thus avoiding the usual arguments of who got to ride with whom. When we arrived, I was amazed by the giant white building we were staying in. It was huge with 2 floors, large living rooms and kitchen, and about 14 bedrooms. To me, it seemed more like a mansion. The garden, though beautiful, was too dangerous for us to play in due to its steep slope and rocks. However, I was fascinated by the swifts nesting near the back patio, as we only had pigeons and sparrows in the city. The most exciting part was choosing a room for myself. Back home, we lived in a small 2-bedroom house, so I shared a room with my siblings. But here, I picked a room at the end of the corridor on the ground floor, far from everyone else. My parents chose a room nearby to keep an eye on us, and on the first night I enjoyed the solitude and fell asleep easily. The second night was different. After dinner, my brother and I played outside until my dad called us in. I was fascinated by the swift nest and reluctant to leave it. Inside, the corridor to my room felt much darker and creepier than the night before. Terrified, I begged my parents to let me switch rooms, but my mother insisted I stay in the room I chose. I sulked back to my room, feeling alone and scared. That night I struggled to sleep. Around 2 hours after I finally dozed off, I woke to a growling sound and saw 2 large glowing eyes in front of my face. A large black dog with shaggy fur and yellowed teeth was snarling at me. I kept flipping over in bed, but the dog would always reappear, growling and staring at me. I finally turned on the bedside lamp and the dog vanished. Thinking it was just a nightmare, I turned off the lamp and tried to sleep again. Soon after, I heard the growling again, this time louder and at the foot of my bed. The dog climbed onto the bed, its claws digging into my thigh. Paralyzed with fear, I opened my eyes and came face to face with the dog's red eyes. I screamed and my parents rushed in. The dog was gone, but my mother dismissed my story as a bad dream. I fell asleep again, but by morning a large bruise had formed where the dog's paw had pressed into my leg, and I hobbled around for the rest of the holiday with my grandma's hiking stick. Despite the terrifying encounter, the rest of the holiday was enjoyable. I switched rooms to be closer to my parents, and we spent our days exploring the beach and making friends with local kids. The Swift chicks hatched 2 days before we left, and I was sad to say goodbye to them. Years later, my friend told me the legend of the black dog in Wales. This creature is said to be an omen of death. Sure enough, my great-great-granddad passed away from a heart attack exactly 2 weeks after my encounter. This experience cemented my belief in the paranormal and remains one of the most vivid and inexplicable events of my life. I was taking my grandfather home. He lives on a farm in Argentina, specifically in Patagonia. It was my father's birthday, and we celebrated it in our town. At the end of the party, I took him home in my truck. On the tree-lined boulevard that precedes his house, something crosses us in the road. It looked a bit like a deer, and this was normal, but what wasn't so normal is that the deer walked on 2 legs, which of course brought me to panic. I slammed on the brakes. The deer stared at us and kept running on 2 legs. I went back to the road due to the desperate request of my grandfather, and the old man did not return to the farm after that. He said, "It's a cambiapieles," which would be similar to the Navajo skinwalker, but in Mapuche mythology, he is not a witcher, but rather a spirit that looks for weak vessels. Grandpa said surely he was looking for him to take over his body, and he ended up staying with us until he died 3 years later. The farm was sold after this. About 18 years ago, my wife and I were looking out at Brickwell Bay in Miami, Florida, when we saw a humanoid-looking creature wearing what looked like a black rubbery environmental suit just effortlessly gliding through the water waist deep. I shouted, "Do you see it there?" Pointed at it so my wife would see it about 50 feet in front of us on a bright sunny afternoon. It looked at us and then started submerging as it quickly headed for the bank until it went under and out of view. It looked like it was wearing an all-black futuristic high-tech equipment, and the really strange part was the bay was over 10 feet deep at the bank. Somehow it could glide through the water with its upper body above the surface. Afterwards, we were both in a state of shock, and our hearts were racing, beating out of our chests. It had big black eyes and a small nose and mouth, and we called it the creature from the Black Lagoon. 10 years ago, I was a high school senior in Hawaii, and my friends and I were chilling on the swing set at his apartment complex. It was around midnight and I noticed a rather large face in the trees about 60 yards away. It had eyes bigger than a human, and it was staring directly at me. 2 seconds later it screeched, opening its mouth and revealing what looked like fangs. I noped out of there and ran to a lamppost in the parking lot. My friend ran after me asking what was wrong, and by the time I looked back into the trees, the figure was gone. Apparently, I was the only one to hear it too. My friends were conversing when all of this happened. Some said it was probably an owl. But what owl has teeth? I did, however, see wings similar to the ones on Gargoyle's body. My Filipino parents told me it was probably an aswang, a vampire in Filipino folklore. We still do occasionally hang out by those swings, but I never saw it again. Around 3 a.m. last night, my girlfriend came home from an event, and we got pretty hungry, so we started making late-night snacks. In her kitchen, there's a big window that is above the sink, in which you're able to get a viewing of the side of her house, and the side gate are for the neighbors. At night, you can't really see much because there aren't any porch lights and the street has very few lampposts. So the only light that can be seen outside is moonlight or from the neighbor's window. We decided to stay up for a few more hours because why not? So I began making us some coffee while she went and fixed herself up in the restaurant. This is when things started to get weird. I grabbed a spoon so that I could scoop some sugar into my coffee, when I noticed a faint blue circle on my jacket, which was a red hoodie. As soon as I noticed, it was completely gone. I looked outside and there weren't any lights on, and the only thing I could see through the window was the entire kitchen because of how bright the kitchen lights are. I tried replicating the blue light with the spoon because I thought maybe something had reflected off of it or something else in the kitchen and onto my shirt, but I couldn't. And I wasn't facing anything that was blue either. I brushed it off instantly, thinking it was just my imagination, and after that, everything was normal. Until this morning. My girlfriend's mother came home earlier this morning complaining about cookies on the floor near her room, and she began blaming the cat and dog, but both of them were asleep in the room with us the entire night with the door closed. Her room is currently in the midst of renovation, so our first conclusion was that one of the workers did a piss poor job at cleaning whatever snack they were eating while on the job. However, upon further inspection, my girlfriend's sister realized that the cookie pieces on the floor were from a cookie container that was inside her room, one she hadn't opened for months. Now it sounds like it could have just been a crazy coincidence that the workers were eating the exact same cookies that her sister had in her room. But what was weirder still was that there were also crumbs around my girlfriend's cookie container on her dresser, as if someone had come in and ate some. Her door was locked, and even if it wasn't, it's extremely unlikely that one of the workers would have come into her room while she was asleep, because the dog would have barked at anyone entering. Once we discussed this, my girlfriend tells us that last night she saw something blue moving outside of that same kitchen window. She didn't tell me because I get anxious easily and thought I wouldn't be able to sleep because of me being on high alert. She said it really looked like a blue wing. With all things said, I began to think that we were visited by the fairies last night, or the fae. I've heard they're attractive to sweets and people up late at night. That could explain the strange blue light I saw briefly. I've also heard that they appear differently to people. I found it more convincing that last night's encounter was indeed the fae, because a few years ago when I was tripping on shrooms for the first time, my friends and I were looking in our car in the complete darkness. We were just coming back from a hiking trail, and on our way up, I saw what appeared to be a firefly, and to my knowledge, fireflies didn't appear anywhere where we were hiking. It was green and glowed faintly. I tried swatting it, and then it vanished into thin air. The light looked exactly like the blue one I saw last night, except a bit more otherworldly. What do you guys think though? Could we have been visited by the fae? Were they playing tricks on us? I don't scare easily at all, but what happened on this night scared me to the bone. It was around 2 months ago, at the full moon. The night was lit up like daylight as the moon was so bright and full. I don't sleep easily or well on full moon nights. I stay up till the wee hours of the morning watching TV before going to sleep. In the living room there's a door to my deck and side yard. This door has a large window that's about 24 by 64 inch, and there was no blind or shade on the window. I've lived in my house 10 years now as an adult, and I've always felt safe in that house, as it is my childhood home. I live smack dab in the middle of town too. My yard is privacy fenced, and the rails are on the inside of my yard. While sitting with my dog, who was lying facing me watching TV, I heard a wolf howl. I know this sound well, as I've lived with a wolf dog for 14 years. I don't think too much about it, as the sound isn't uncommon in the area. At 2 a.m, my dog raises her head suddenly, stretched her neck as never before, and in slow motion turned her head towards me. The total look of fright on her face shocked me. I leaned forward and looked at the door and saw yellow wolf eyes staring at me through the window. They were about dog eye level until whatever it was stood up. Then it vanished. I got my .357 handgun out and held it until dawn. I have since covered that window. My sister and the one son I told this story to said it was probably some teen trying to scare someone, and it just happened to be me. Well, I don't agree with that. They didn't see my dog's reaction. What dog moves in slow motion unless they're totally freaked out? She didn't jump up and bark. Any dog would at least bark unless it was scared. Just because we live in town doesn't mean strange things don't happen. I don't think I'll view a full moon the same way again. 6 years ago, I started seeing something out of the corner of my eye, out of windows or while I was standing outside. It began as random flashes, black followed by white. At first, I honestly thought there was something wrong with my eyes, but according to my optometrist, they're perfect. Over that year, the flashes would last a little longer, until I was seeing the full bodies of a black wolf-like being chased by a white one. I saw them several times a week, usually while I was home, but sometimes when I was out as well. To be honest, I didn't really mind. I didn't tell anyone. Weird stuff had happened to me my entire life, and this seemed to be a less threatening event. I simply thought of them as my black and white dogs. This continued in varying frequency for the next 4 years. I got married, moved a few times, and we finally ended up living with my sister and her husband. This is 2 years ago, and it's when something unsettling happened. I didn't see the white dog. The black dog would run past a window, and I would turn waiting for the white one who was always right behind it. But it never came. Something about this made goosebumps rise all over my body. For weeks I would see the black dog and hope that the white dog would be there too, but it wasn't, and my uneasiness grew. One day my husband and I were driving to the grocery store, and about half a mile down the road the black dog walked slowly out of the woods onto the road and faced our car. I took in a sharp breath, and it ran suddenly towards us. My husband swerved and the black dog ran back into the woods. I called out to my husband asking if he'd seen it, but it turned out he only swerved to avoid hitting a dead raccoon. I told him what I had seen and what I had been seeing for the last 4 years. He thought it was interesting, but my husband has no belief in the paranormal at all and just kind of acknowledged it without putting stock in it. Later that day, when we got home from the store, we were putting the groceries from the car into the house when a massive barking growl startled my husband so badly that he dropped the groceries and immediately went towards the sound. It came from directly behind us in some shrubs. He was positive my sister's Great Dane had gotten out and called for her. Meanwhile, I was grinning ear to ear because I knew she wasn't out. There wasn't a dog in the trees. I was right, and he was bothered. Cut to later that week. My sister came into my room early in the morning, visibly shaken. "Keys, something happened last night." My sister had just had a baby boy. The night before, she woke up to see her oldest son standing beside her baby's crib staring down at him. She told the little boy to go back to bed, and he looked at her. That's when she realized the boy was not her child. He had dark brown hair and black eyes. She immediately pointed her finger and told him he didn't belong here, and the boy vanished. Needless to say, we were all uneasy, but for some reason it wasn't until the next thing that happened that we got serious about what was going on in the house. A few nights later, My sister awoke to the sound of her Great Dane pacing around her room and bumping into her baby's crib. Not wanting Penny to wake up the baby, she called her over. The dog walked over to bed and laid its head on my sister's stomach. She patted the dog's head a few times and then told it to lay down. The dog did, and my sister went back to sleep. When she woke up, she asked her husband where Penny was because she wasn't in the room. Her husband gave her a funny look and said that she was in the crate. My sister asked when he had gotten up to put her in there, thinking maybe she had gotten on the bed and woken him up. But he hadn't. Apparently he had put her there before they fell asleep. When my sister told me that, I began freaking out a little. I couldn't help but think my black dog was in our house and something was paying too much attention to her new baby. We spent the next day very intentionally praying. We were all done with whatever was happening in our house. I didn't see the dog for a while after that, but a few months ago I caught the shape out of the corner of my eye and turned only to see the white dog hot on its heels. If anyone knows what exactly we're dealing with, I would love to know, as I am at my wit's end at this point. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, you can let me know down below. I'm going to be back in a few days with even more stories, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And a huge thanks as always to my members and patrons for their continued support. For those of you who do support me over on Patreon, you're getting new content every week, all summer, so I hope you enjoy. And I'll see you in the next one. Good night.